In a new piece for Reason magazine, my colleague Elizabeth Nolan Brown breaks down how politicians are using online safety for children as an excuse to censor speech. Is childproofing the internet really going to protect young people? Here to discuss further is Elizabeth Nolan Brown. Nice to see you, Liz.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. This is something I write about as well, and we talk about a lot on the show. You and I are both passionate about this. All these efforts we're seeing now targeted at various social media sites, including Snapchat, and then age verifications being talked about. What do you make? What is the landscape right now? How has it changed in terms of trying to restrict access to social media?
I think that the big change is just the rapid pace of new measures being introduced. We've seen a lot of proposals to regulate tech over the past 5 or 6 years, but a lot of them were focusing on antitrust law or on maybe political bias, Section 230, a lot of other issues. Suddenly it seems like they're all focused on protecting children. And, that happens in a lot of different ways. A lot of them, like you said, have to do with age verification. There are other ones having to deal with just banning certain social media sites like TikTok outright. There's a lot of different schemes, but all of them are centered on this idea that we need new legislation to protect kids from the internet.
Right. I think my viewpoint is certainly using social media too much all the time can be bad in some cases for some kids, just as doing, too much of anything to any degree could be bad for people of any age. But a lot of kids actually get value out of social media in terms of connecting with their friends, especially as we came through the pandemic, getting new sources of information, a creative outlet in some cases. Talk to us about the portrait of social media's impact on kids' mental health, because we hear in the mainstream media all the time that this is such a crisis, this is such an emergency, kids have never been more depressed. It's obvious it's their smartphones. What do you make of that?
Yeah, we've had Aaron Brown at Reason doing a lot of stuff on this lately. He's a statistician, and he's been showing that a lot of these studies that are showing that it's social media causing the mental health problems are not very good. The data that they're based on is not very good. Like you said, obviously social media can be bad for certain minors, for certain teens, for certain children, but it's not universally bad. And like you said, also there's a lot of good effects. It is an outlet for creative expression. It's an outlet for finding information. I think one of the most important things is an outlet for community, especially for teens who are, maybe in marginalized groups, who don't feel like their identities are being respected in their schools or by their families. This is a place where people can actually feel like they belong, and to entirely cut teenagers off from that outlet, as some of these proposals would do, I think would make things, a lot worse for a lot of the mental health of children and teens.
I can't help but note that there are parallels here between the effort to use concern over children to limit speech and the way that concerns over children have been used since the 1970s to, let's say, attack the gay rights movement. Right now, so much of the focus about anti-trans legislation is about the children, even though so much now is expanding predictably far beyond what children are doing into the adult realm. There are conversations happening that kind of exclude the role of parents as being able to make these decisions, intervene, decide whether or not their kids can have phones in the first place, et cetera. What do you make of these arguments that seem to ignore the extent to which there are parents ostensibly or caregivers in the home that should be playing a role here, as opposed to pivoting everything into this kind of rather authoritarian governmental sphere?
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. And I think, it's great when social media companies give parents the tools to limit their children's use, or put different controls on there to have different, levels of privacy and security available for teens. But when you ban it outright, or some of these things, like they create a duty of care so that social media companies could be sued if they make available any content that could harm children. And like you said, we see a lot of very expanded definitions of harm right now. So, some people think like, oh, anything that could harm children, of course, that's got got to be, very serious, dangerous stuff. But we have legislators in some states trying to define anything related to LGBT people as harmful. We have, any information about contraception and abortion as harmful. Any information about certain, theories around race as harmful. So I think that, if you give the government this power, it could end up being used in a very broad way to define harm against kids.
Right, and you mentioned a lot of examples where maybe conservatives could exploit the what's harmful in order to do censorship. Happens on the other side too, right? There's the Democratic legislators everywhere the new crackdown on misinformation, how all sorts of things are harmful to people. Speech itself is harmful. I say this to people on the right, like even let's say social media is just as harmful as you think it is. Are we really going to create a system where you have to hand over your driver's license to prove you can be on a social media site? Are we going to limit access? Are we going to create some surveillance state to accomplish this kind of, how would that scheme benefit those of us who are for free speech and think, the Democratic Party, as well as the Republican Party, is trying to crack down on that? Why is it a good idea to give the state governments or the federal governments more power to restrict what is ultimately speech or decide what's harmful?
Yeah. I don't want people on the left or on the right to be defining, what is harmful, what is allowed to be seen on the internet, which a lot of these would do. And a lot of these would also, some of these proposals say that you must have parental consent for 13 to 17-year-olds to join. And they must give the parents the passwords or access to their kid's account, which also seems very dangerous because, unfortunately, not all parents are supportive and loving, and that could really backfire in giving some abusive families the access to their not letting their children have an outlet online that their parents couldn't see could actually again be very dangerous for kids' mental health.
Yeah, it seems like that kind of check and balance is obviously beneficial, having some flexibility there. It does feel like with some of these legislation, like the rules that would require teachers to report about the kids' identity expression in school and things like that, that is the point. The conservative legislators who are pushing that legislation very much want the kids to be constrained in their expression at home by the parents, even if you or I may think that kind of behavior is abusive and actually in and of itself harmful to the kid. But those are all very subjective things, and which is why I think a lot of us will default to, I would rather there's just be more openness on the internet and parents are going to have to do what they have to do, but we don't all live in an authoritarian state because it would help someone's parenting goals. It's also worth noting that a lot of these rules, they do start out with the kids, but they get more expansive. Louisiana was the first state to start requiring age verification to watch pornography. There's 7 more states that want people to start offering up their driver's licenses. You talked about how there's a threat to end-to-end encryption because people want to be able to look at messages, whereas many of us believe that end-to-end encryption is much more safe and secure, and the companies are invested in end-to-end encryption because they are not as subject to liability, because the police officers are asking them to open up people's messaging box to get to the bottom of crimes or what have you. I mean, where do you think this is ultimately going to go as this keeps getting battled out in these culture war contexts that are a little bit divorced from the pure free speech context that I think we're all invested in here?
I think that the points you brought up there are really important because obviously age verification doesn't stop at children and teenagers. If you're going to verify people's ages, that means everybody has to do it. That means adults of all ages have to turn over their IDs or their biometric data in some cases or something like that to the state or to the different social media companies, or sometimes like in Louisiana, it's a state-run system. So to the state in order to verify their identities, which gives the social media companies all of this private information on people, children and adults alike, and it makes people vulnerable to hackers, makes them vulnerable to identity thieves, it makes them vulnerable to all sorts of cybercrime and all sorts of bad actors as well. So, and the same thing for the encryption proposals. Some of these proposals would say that, could say that using end-to-end encryption makes you reckless and then therefore liable for child pornography, which is, sites are already liable if they knowingly host it. But this could say that if they use end-to-end encryption, they're being reckless, so therefore they might be liable. And that would undermine everyone's privacy again, not for any clear benefit, because again, we're talking about things that are already illegal, that sites are already taking proactive steps to stop. This would just sort of undermine the privacy of everybody who's not doing anything wrong as well.
Elizabeth Nolan Brown, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.